Hey gang, Jane back today with a crochet technique tutorial. Today we're going to discuss blocking our squares, the hows, the whys, and all the good stuff. I get a lot of questions on the topic of blocking, and yes, I do block my squares most of the time, but not always. So let's jump right in and start with why we would even need to consider blocking our squares. The two reasons I block my squares are 1, to make them easier to handle and easier to join, and 2, to freshen them up a little. As a general rule, I like to block my squares before I sew them together. Often when you finish your square, you may find it curls up on the edges or generally does not lie flat or even is a bit wonky. Blocking is a gentle way to make your square relax into its intended shape, and it's also a lot more enjoyable to join them together when they've been tamed down a little and are more likely to behave. It's also a way to freshen up or clean your squares before assembling them, especially if you're working on them in hot summer weather and you have sweaty hands, or perhaps outside on the beach where there's lots of sand. This, however, will depend on the yarn that you're using. So when do I block and when do I just leave it be? The beauty of any textile craft, and especially true for crochet, is the fabric has a mind of its own and we all create with a different touch and tension. And if there's anything that's consistent in crochet, it's that more often than not, every piece will come out with its own personality and style. Now, we don't want to crush the uniqueness of our squares, and we are not looking for uniform little duplicates. We're not a machine, we're a creative being making one-of-a-kind handmade items. So generally I say use your own instinct as to whether or not you want to block your pieces, or if you feel it will take away from the handmade look. When I finish my squares, they may look like this. Edges curled, certain parts sticking up. In general, this will settle down on its own with use or wear of the finished piece, but I like to give it a head start and relax the yarn into the intended shape. Once I give them a little block, they're much easier to join and work with. It also depends on the yarn you're using. Personally, most of my squares are made with machine washable Easy Care acrylics. Be sure you check the yarn label for care before doing any form of blocking, and also be very attentive to yarns with special textures in them. You don't want to do all this work and then lose that special texture of the yarn in a blocking process. In these cases, be very gentle with how you handle these yarns and maybe skip the blocking and just do a final care of the finished item. If it's a delicate hand wash and lay flat to dry, then that will suffice for any blocking that you will need. I use blocking mostly to tame my squares enough to work with them. I want them to work together well and create an overall cohesive piece. Pieces that have a lot of space in them, like a lacy look, may need a little help with relaxing into the intended shape. The larger the square, the more likely you will want to give it a block. But small squares, and especially solid stitch squares, I find are rarely needing this help. And so I tend not to block anything smaller than say 4 or 5 inches. It really doesn't serve a purpose, unless they need to be freshened up, and then I may just block the finished piece by giving it a quick and delicate wash. So what do I need to block? Because there are 2 ways to do this, it depends on which method you choose as to what you'll need. The simplest way to get started is a simple damp or wet block. This is how I did it for years, and I still use this method a lot. So the supplies that you'll need for the towel method are 2 or more towels, pins if you want to pin them, and a measuring tape or a ruler to measure out your squares, and of course your squares. Also, you'll want a sink or a bucket to soak your squares in, or just a spray bottle full of water to use for a light spray. The second method, which is now my main go-to method, is the steam block. This one you will need a few more tools, but some you may already have on hand. The tools I use now are a steamer, foam blocking mats that are pre-marked for ease of measurements, and T-pins, so I don't lose them in the fabric. I'll list my favorite supplies in the description below so you can find them as well. The foam mats I use are already pre-marked with a 1-inch square. They also have a nice radial measurement on them for my circular pieces. This is a really cool pack that I got off of Amazon. They come in a nice case as well, so they're easy to store. However, you don't have to get a kit like this. These foam mats are the same foam mats that you can get for children's play areas. They come in about packs of 4, and then you can just use a ruler to measure it out yourself. So how do I block? We'll start with the wet block method because it's the simpler one. For this method, you can either pre-soak your squares in a sink of cool water, which will really soak all the fibers and get more of a block, or you can use a spray bottle for a lighter touch. If you're doing the soak method, then once you have the squares wet, use one of your towels to gently roll them up into. Your goal is to absorb as much of the water out of them as you can so they won't take as long to dry. By rolling them in the towel, it helps get the water through all the fibers and is a gentle way to wring them out. Next, you'll lay your second towel, and sometimes I'll lay 2 towels out to protect the surface underneath. Lay out your squares on the towel and shape them using your hands, using a measuring tape or ruler to measure out the size you want them to be, and then you can either pin them in place, or you can just give them a good hand press to ensure that they stay in place and allow them to dry this way. In this method, I don't like to stack as there's a lot of drying to do. The other option is, instead of soaking them, lay them out either on the towels or the foam boards and use a spray bottle. Spritz your squares, press and shape with your hands, or use pins and then allow them to dry like that. Be sure your squares are somewhere safe where they can lie undisturbed for the day or overnight. Now let's explore the second method where we use the steamer and the foam boards. So I have my foam board here, and this is the center one of the packs. As you can see, the center circle is here. They all have a different, this one is an outer one, an outer corner. But I like to layer them on top of each other simply because I want them to be thick enough. You can see here, I want this thickness because when I put my pin in, I want it to be able to go in far enough, but not mark the table that I'm on. So I have my T pins, and that means it's a pin with a T top to it so that it works really well with these. You don't lose it in your fabric. And I have one of my squares. So this is the Eclipse square, and it's 8 inches by 8 inches finished. So I'm going to use my little squares on here to mark it out. So I take my first T-pin, and I just pick one of the corners, and I place it with one of the corners here. And I just push it in, so it's upright. Now I'm going to measure out the 8 by 8 all the way around. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So that corner is the next corner. And I take my chain corner and place it there. Now we're going to go down 8 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And place it there. And then we go across here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And we pull it to there. So I don't want to overstretch it. I just want it to sit uniformly in a square. If you have something that doesn't have these grids, that's okay too. You can just measure it using a ruler. You come from your center point, make sure that you have straight across and straight down here so that your square is not skewed. So if you need to and you find anywhere on your square isn't really behaving properly, you can add extra pins in to the process. I'm going to put one on each side just to give you the idea of what I mean. And I'm just placing them so that the square holds its shape. So there you can see is my first square. So at this point, I will steam this square. Now, I got so caught up on pinning these that I forgot to film the actual steaming part on that last square. So I'm going to show you how to steam on a different square. Same thing, just a different square. Once I have the first square pinned in place, I'll use my steamer to lightly, and I emphasize lightly, steam the square into shape. Do not touch the square with the steamer because it will crush your fibers. Now back to our first square, let's pin a second square. So unlike the wet block, these steam block squares can stack in between the steaming. They don't have to dry as much because the steam is powerful, but it doesn't soak the squares, so they dry faster. Once this square is steamed, then I will place another one on top. And this way I don't have to add any new pins. I just slide the chain spaces onto the pins. See how I just kind of stretch this chain space right here and I slide it onto the pin. You take the corner, you find the space, and you just slip it onto the pin. This works really well when you have chain space corners. Then for these ones, you can do the same. You can just slide it into any space along the edge for each of the ones on the sides, just to give it that extra stability. Continue to do that all the way around. And we have our second square, and then I would steam it again. And the nice thing is the square underneath will get extra steam. You can generally stack about 2 to 4 squares this way. It all depends on the length of your T-pins, how thick your yarn is, and keep in mind that there is a little bit of drying to do. Now your squares will be easier to work with while you join them. If you forget to block, or perhaps you're not somewhere where it's easy to do this, such as traveling, then go ahead and join them together, and then when you're able, Either give your finished piece a block in one of the ways that I've already suggested for the squares, or if it's an easy care yarn, you can give it a delicate wash and dry, or you can just lay it flat to dry. This works just as well, but it does take up a lot more space and may take longer to dry. You may have to lay it flat for a couple days. Some people swear by washing the item before gifting it, as the yarn has spent a lot of time in your hands, but not all yarn is easy care, so it depends on what you're making and what yarn you're working with. I like to make a lot of easy care blankets that I give as gifts, and I like to make sure they're fresh and that they wash up well before I give them to the new little ones. Hopefully this gives you a little more info on the blocking process and helps you decide if and when you want to block and how you'd like to do it. If you're interested in more information on the tools I use, I'll leave the links for those in the description below. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please remember to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe to my channel so you're sure to catch all my tutorials as they come out. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.